Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Daniel Foster's desk sat at the end of the fourth row at Ashford & Cole Group, tucked into a window that overlooked the parking garage instead of the river. There was no photograph on it, no plaque, no novelty mug, no dying succulent someone had gifted him at a holiday party he hadn't attended. Just a monitor, a keyboard, and a green legal pad squared exactly to the corner of the desk. People walked past it 40 times a day and never once slowed down. He had worn the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation for 2 years, sleeves always pushed to the elbow, boots scuffed at the toe from 6 years walking his daughter to the bus stop before sunrise. Nobody at Ashford & Cole knew that part. They knew him as the quiet one in accounts management, the man who answered emails at 6:14 in the morning, never once raised his voice in a meeting. Twice the firm had opened a leadership track. Twice his name had never made it onto the list, and twice nobody had asked him why. The truth was arithmetic, not ambition. Leadership meant travel, and travel meant someone else picking up his daughter Mia from 2nd grade on the days her mother's shift ran long. So Daniel took the account nobody wanted, the dead ones, the angry ones, the ones that came with 3-page complaint threads and a note from legal saying good luck. When the Choctaw Ridge distributor account went dark for 6 weeks, Daniel rebuilt it with 14 phone calls and a revised payment plan nobody else had thought to offer. When a compliance filing bounced back 19 hours before a hard deadline, he found the transposed line item at 1:52 in the morning and had a corrected packet couriered to the state office by 7:15. The office knew these things happened. The office did not connect them to him, because his manager never once stood up in a meeting and said his name out loud. That manager was Renee Sinclair, and she had run the accounts division for 2 years and 4 months with her crest and her ambition on her people, the way other people wore perfume, impossible to miss once you were close enough to notice it. The division director, a man named Walsh, was retiring in November. Renee had already had 2 informal coffees with board members. Her presentation deck already had 12 slides, and there was one thing standing between her and that office on the 14th floor. It wasn't a rival. Daniel had never applied for anything in his life. It was worse than a rival. It was correspondence log itself, the one she pulled every Friday afternoon, the way other people check stock prices. Every quarter, underneath the wind she presented upstairs, the same name sat quietly in the footnotes, not in her slides. Not in her voice when she said our team delivered. Underneath, in the substrate, Choctaw Ridge, the compliance fix. A renegotiated freight contract in Bartlesville that is to save the firm $400,000 a year. If anyone and above her ever pulled the raw file instead of reading her singer summary, they would find a department that ran one desk by the window, and a woman who spent 2 years describing another man's work as her own leadership. She told herself this was normal. Manager's present team results, that was the job description. But somewhere in the last 8 months, the story had gotten harder to hold because it wasn't spread across a team anymore. They were concentrating, and concentration has a way of becoming visible to anyone who actually looks. Then came Harmon Freight Logistics. It started small, and it started with Daniel cuz Renee had approved his travel expense to a regional logistics conference in Wichita and thought nothing of it at the time. A cold conversation at a coffee stand. A follow-up call 2 weeks later. Then another. Walter Grady, who ran West Coast Partnerships, was known across the industry as a man who had walked away from 3 vendors in 18 months over what he called promise problems. He didn't respond to sales pitches. He responded to a man who called him back at 9 p.m. and never oversold a single deliverable. By August, it was a negotiation. By October, it was a signed letter of intent worth $9.4 million over 4 years, the single logistics contract in the firm's history. And Renee did what she always did. She built the summary. She presented the progress in the monthly executive review. She used the word we so many times it stopped meaning anything, and nobody upstairs ever asked to see the raw thread underneath it, because why would they? What she told herself, Standing in front of that mirror on the morning of October 14th was that the deal was essentially finished. The terms were settled. The relationship was built. Whatever remained was paperwork, and paperwork required the man by the window. It required a director's signature, and in 5 weeks there would be a new director, and everything after that would belong to whoever was holding the pen. There was one thing she hadn't read. Grady had insisted on a personnel continuity clause in the final annex, negotiated directly between him and Daniel across 3 separate calls in the last week of drafting. Renee had received that annex as an email attachment on a Wednesday afternoon. It ran 36 pages with appendices, and she had dinner reservations that night, so she filed it. She had every intention of reading it later. That's the thing about later. It rarely asks permission before it runs out. What happened over the next 19 hours would end her career and expose exactly how long a man can run on a lie before the math catches up. On the night of October 14th, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a laptop and a mug of coffee gone cold, because Harmon's executive committee seats 2 time zones ahead, and final language on liability transfer had to be locked before their board convened at dawn. The call started at 9:40 p.m. It was still running at 3:50 in the morning. Grady stayed in the line the entire time and apologized twice for the hour. Daniel told him not to. They worked through the indemnity schedule clause by clause, and at one point Grady pushed back hard on a limitation Ashford and Cole's own legal team had inserted. Daniel did something a salesman never does. He agreed with him. He said the clause protected the firm and not the partnership, and he proposed alternate language that gave Harmon more room to operate. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Grady said that in 21 years of vendor negotiations, he had never once had a supplier argue against his own legal department at 4 in the morning, and that this was the reason he was ready to sign at all. Daniel said something modest and moved to the next line item. He didn't write the moment down. It never occurred to him that it mattered. The call ended at 4:12 a.m. He slept for 1 hour and 40 minutes and woke to a phone that hadn't charged because he'd unplugged it to power the laptop instead. He badged into the office at 9:41 on the morning of October 15th, 41 minutes past the start of core hours. The first time in a year he had been late to anything. Renee had been at her desk since 7:50. She watched him come off the elevator, and what moved through her wasn't calculation. It was relief. The specific relief of someone who had already decided something and has just been handed a cleaner reason for it. At 8:44 that morning, before he ever walked through the door, she had opened a departmental template and generated a document she intended to use before the end of the week. His lateness didn't create the decision. It only made it convenient. She called a meeting for 10 noon in the 3rd floor conference room and asked Trent Hutt, a mid-level analyst 2 desks down, to sit in as a witness. She didn't tell him why. Daniel walked in holding the Harmon file. He set it on the table and didn't open it. Renee asked what time he'd arrived. He told her and she wrote it down. She asked if he was aware of the core hours policy. He said he was. She asked if he'd filed a schedule variance notice, and he said he hadn't because he'd been on a call with Harmon's executive committee until nearly 4 that morning. She didn't ask about the call. That was a choice, and she made it in under a second. He looked at her notes instead and said that the department couldn't evaluate personal explanations for policy failures, because if it did, everyone would have one. She said this reflected a pattern of unreliability. She used the phrase repeated availability concerns, which described nothing that had ever actually happened. Trent Wallace at the end of the table wrote it down like it was fact. Daniel put his hand flat on the folder. He said that there was a $9.4 million agreement inside it that had reached final language 6 hours earlier, and that if she wanted to talk about the last 19 hours, that was what the last 19 hours had been. Renee said the deal was a departmental achievement, and that no individual was going to use a client relationship as a shield for personal conduct. She said it evenly, without raising her voice, and it landed harder than shouting would have. Then she opened her folder, slid a single sheet across the table. A voluntary resignation letter, already dated, already formatted with his name, his title, and his employee ID in the appropriate fields. The only blank space on the entire page was the signature line. She told him the company would treat this as a mutual decision, which would protect his record, and that the alternative was a formal disciplinary process that would follow him wherever he went next. She said it was a professional courtesy, extended because she respected his contributions. Daniel looked at the date printed on the letter and understood the page had existed before this meeting. Probably before the morning, possibly before he had ever walked in late at all. He told her there was a personnel clause in Act 4 of the Harmon Agreement negotiated in the final week, and that she needed to read it before either of them signed anything. He said it in the same flat register he used for everything, which was exactly the problem. It didn't sound like a warning. Renee said she'd reviewed the Harmon documentation thoroughly and wasn't going to let a policy conversation turn into a contract briefing. She asked him to decide. He asked Trent, without turning his head, whether he thought this was reasonable. Trent shifted in his chair and said everyone had to be held to the same standard, that if a specialist could roll in whenever he wanted, it undermined the whole floor. He said the word discipline. It wasn't exactly a lie. It was a man choosing which side of the table to sit on and choosing fast. Daniel heard the choice clearly. Renee said she'd give him a few minutes and left the room door open. Not an accident. Within 90 seconds, the shape of it had crossed the full floor the way these things always do. When Daniel stepped out for water, two people at the printer went quiet. Someone near the break room said loud enough to carry that it was about time somebody addressed it. Another voice agreed the department couldn't run on special cases. Daniel stood in that hallway with a paper cup in his hand and did the only arithmetic that actually mattered to him. 6 years raising Mia alone. 14 phone calls to Choctaw Ridge, a compliance packet couriered at 7:15 in the morning. 4 months building trust with a man 2 time zones away who had walked away from 3 vendors in 18 months. 6 hours on a call the night before, arguing against his own legal department because it was the honest thing to do. And in the 4 minutes since that door had opened, not one person on that floor had asked him a single question. Not what happened, not why he was late. Not what was in the folder on the table. 30 people who had watched him work for 6 years reached their verdict in under 4 minutes. And the verdict was that he was a problem being handled. That was the thing that finally moved in him. Not anger, he'd never had much talent for anger. Something quieter and more permanent. He'd spent 6 years believing that if you did the work properly, the record would eventually speak for you. Standing in that hallway, he understood there was no record. There was only the story people told, and he had never told one, and someone else had been telling his for 2 years. He walked back in. Renee asked if he'd reached a decision. He picked up the pen. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for the HR representative he was entitled to. He didn't raise the annex a second time. He signed his name on the line, straightened the page, and slid it back across the table. Then he said the only thing from that room Renee would remember for the rest of her career. He told her she had never once asked what he would for, and one day she was going to wish she had. She took it as a threat, filed it as bitterness. No time. He went back to his desk and packed a copier box. It took 9 minutes because there was almost nothing to pack. A legal pad, a spare phone charger, a department mug he had never once used. He left the laptop, the badge, and the Harmon folder squared at the center of the desk, because the folder belonged to the company, and he had never been the kind of man who took things that weren't his. Nobody stood up. Someone near the elevators said, "Take care," in a voice pitched for the room instead of for him. Renee waited for the doors to close, then stepped into the center of the floor, put both hands at the back of an empty chair, and one people that after one and done not to find the couple us that finally moving forward. And one Trump's reeling at the obstacles, the way of where this team was headed. The applause started with Trent Wallace. It spread the way applause always does, out of relief, social reflex, and the ordinary wish to be standing with the winner. Someone laughed. Someone asked if the tab was open. 16 floors up, the chairwoman of Ashford and Cole Group had been reading the same document since 9 that morning. Retention hook. What she found on page 31 was about to turn a celebration into a crisis nobody in that building saw coming. Eleanor Winthrop had run the company for mate, and what she trusted was paper, not because she just trusted her managers, but because she had learned early that summaries are separate and written by people with an interest in how they read. It was a principle she applied rigorously to contracts, and as she would later admit in front of 30 people, not nearly rigorously enough to her own organization. The Harmon Agreement had arrived, fully executed, at 9 a.m. that morning, carrying signatures from her board dated 6 a.m. $9.4 million over 4 years. Eleanor had cleared her calendar and started at page 1. She was still reading 2 hours later when she read X4, section 11, subsection C. The agreement's execution was contingent on Daniel Foster's continuous direct engagement as program lead. In the event of his departure from Ashford and Cole for any reason, Harmon reserved the unilateral right to terminate without penalty. His name appeared 9 times across 3 pages. No substitution clause, no cure period. Eleanor sought twice to fall down on the 4th floor to arrange an introduction, because in 7 years she had never once been in a room with the man whose name apparently anchored the largest contract the company had ever signed. An assistant told her Mr. Foster had resigned that morning and had already cleared his desk. She didn't ask a second question. She took the stairwell instead of waiting for the elevator, annex still in her hand. The door on 4 opened in the middle of a conversation about whether the bar downtown took reservations for parties over 20. Renee came out of her office already smiling, already assembling a greeting, because a visit from the chairwoman on a day like this could only mean one thing. Eleanor said the Harmon board had executed the agreement at 6 that morning. $9.4 million over 4 years, the largest single contract in company history. For about 2 seconds, the floor reacted the way any floor reacts to good news. Someone actually clapped once before realizing nobody else had. Then Eleanor held up the annex and read Section 11 subsection C out loud, all of it. She didn't soften the sentence about unilateral termination. She said Harmon's confidence rested on one named individual, that the individual was 9 times, and that the name was Daniel Foster. She lowered the pages and asked for the second time where he was. The silence had a specific quality to it. Not shock exactly. 30 people simultaneously reviewing the last hour of their own behavior. Renee recovered first because she had to. She said Daniel had resigned voluntarily that morning, that it had been his own decision, and that the department had accepted it with regret. She heard how thin the word regret sounded in her own mouth. Eleanor asked what time. Renee said around 10. Eleanor said Harmon's board had signed at 6. Which meant that for 4.5 hours, Ashford and Cole had been part of an agreement conditioned on man it was in the process of removing, and that the condition had been broken by the company itself, in this building, by someone standing on this floor. Trent Wallace was staring at the carpet near the break room. The person who had said it was about time somebody addressed it had gone entirely still. Eleanor asked who had handled the resignation. Renee said she had, that there had been an attendance issue. Eleanor asked whether anyone in that meeting had known time at the time that Daniel Foster call had been on a negotiation call with Harmon's executive team until nearly 4 that morning. Renee said no. It was the first outright lie, and she told it standing next to the man who had written down repeated availability concerns, whilst Daniel had the word 9.4 golf now out loud in that same room. Eleanor told her to have Daniel on the phone before end of day and rode the elevator back up. The first call went to voicemail at 12:04. So did the second. By 4 o'clock, Renee had called 9 times and sent 6 messages. Daniel was sitting in his car in a grocery store parking lot when the calls started. He watched her name light up the screen and didn't touch the phone. He wasn't being dramatic about it. He simply had nothing left to say to her, and he'd spent 6 years being the person who always picked up. At 4:30, Eleanor stopped delegating and called Walter Grady herself. She told him the truth because there was no version of the next 24 hours in which lying to Walter Grady improved anything. She said Daniel Foster had been separated from the company that morning, that she hadn't been informed that it appeared he'd into signing a present resignation letter, that she intended to correct it. Grady listened without interrupting. Then he explained why the clause existed. He said Harmon had walked away from 3 vendors in 18 months. And the reason had been identical every time Person who built the relationship was gone within a year of signature, replaced by someone who had never made a single one of the promises being enforced. He said his board had authorized $9.4 million on one condition, and the condition wasn't a company. It was a person. He gave her until end of business the following day. If Daniel Foster wasn't confirmed in his role by then, Harmon would exercise insurance right, and he added without any pleasure in his voice that his board would be extremely reluctant to reopen talks with a firm that had done this once, at any price, in any future year. By 5 Latim, the crisis had climbed the entire boom. Legal reported the resignation document had been generated from a department at 8:44 that morning, 57 minutes, before Daniel had badged in at 9:41. Lance was modeling exposure well past $9 million, because 2 vendor commitments had already been made against the contract's first-year volume. HR reported that Daniel had never requested a representative, that none had been offered, and that no prior written warning existed anywhere in his personnel file. His last 3 performance reviews sat in the top decile of the department. All 3 carried Renee Sinclair's signature. Renee sat alone in her glass office that evening, watching the internal messaging system light up floor by floor, understanding by degree that what she had built was not going to hold. Retention hook, but the review would uncover over the next 36 wasn't one bad morning. It was a method, and it had a paper trail 2 years long. Eleanor found Daniel the next morning by driving to his house at 7:40, because he had answered nothing and she had run out of intermediaries. She stood on his front step in an unbuttoned coat and told him she wasn't there as his former employer, but as the person who had failed to notice what was happening inside her own building. He let her in. They sat at the kitchen table where the laptop had been 18 hours earlier, and the coffee she was offered, the first thing from Ashford and Cole, had given him in a very long time. Eleanor told him about the annex, about Grady's deadline, about exposure running past $9 million. She offered him the director title, a substantial raise, and a written apology in whatever form he wanted. Daniel listened to all of it the same way he'd listened to Grady on the indemnity schedule without interrupting. Then he told her she had it backward. He hadn't signed the letter because he was being fired. He'd signed it because he'd stood in that hallway for 4 minutes, and 30 people who had watched him work for 6 years hadn't asked one question. Not what happened, not why he was late, not what was in the folder. The money had never been the thing, he said. What he'd wanted for 6 years was for the work to be visible while it was happening. It never had been. $9.4 million hadn't changed that. It had only made it expensive. Restructure whatever he asked it to. Daniel said companies restructure when a contract is at risk, and then they go back to exactly how they were. He'd watched the shape of that pattern to recognize it before it finished forming. He said he was grateful she'd come and meant it, and then he said no. She left at 8:10 without an answer. At 11 that morning, Walter Grady called Eleanor directly. Harmon's board had convened early and authorized formal notice of termination under Section 11, subsection C, to transmit at close of business unless the continuity condition was satisfied. The letter was drafted. He read her the first paragraph so there'd be no ambiguity about what was coming. Then he told her one more thing, without any satisfaction in it. If Ashford and Cole couldn't keep Daniel Foster, Harmon intended to approach him directly. He said the man had spent 4 months building something on the strength of his own name, and Harmon would rather employ that than litigate over it. The exposure was no longer $9 million and a damaged reputation. It was the live possibility that the man the company had thrown out on a Tuesday would be running the same program from the other side of the table by the end of the quarter. Renee was summoned to the executive floor at 11:40 and came up with a folder of her own and a version of events rehearsed twice in the elevator. She said Daniel had been managing an attendance pattern for months, that the resignation had been mutual, and that she'd acted to protect departmental standards. Eleanor let her finish. Then she turned her monitor around and showed her one line of document metadata, created 8:44 A.M. Badge record 9:41 a.m. She asked a single question: had Renee known about the Harmon call when she put that letter on the table? Renee didn't answer. The silence answered for her. Eleanor plus the pending formal review, and asked her to surrender her building credentials before leaving the floor. The review opened at 1:00 that afternoon, run by Eleanor herself alongside General Counsel and the head of HR, because the deadline was and there was no time to convene a committee. Eleanor gave them one instruction. They weren't looking for a conclusion. They were looking for the sequence. The correspondence log came first. 940 items across 4 months, and the shape of it was visible within 10 minutes. The Wichita introduction, the follow-up calls, 41 separate exchanges with Walter Grady between June and September, every one of them originating from Daniel's account, most of them sent outside standard hours because of the time difference. Not a single message in the entire thread carried Renee Sinclair in the censor field. Then the calendar. 3 sessions with Harmon's executive committee across August and October, all created by Daniel, all sent to the department distribution list, all declined by Renee without ever being opened. The last one, titled Harmon Final Terms Overnight Session, had been declined on a Friday afternoon while she sat in the very same system full of correspondence logs for her own quarterly summary. The recorded portion of the September executive review was harder to sit through. HR pulled the audio and played 4 minutes of it. On the recording, Renee described the Harmon negotiation to the board, using the phrase, "our team," and then undermined my direct oversight. A board member asked who the point of contact was. Renee said the department maintained the relationship. She had never once said Daniel's name in an executive meeting. Not once in 4 months. General Counsel checked the 2 prior quarterly reviews and corrected it. That's the one point where the pattern stopped resembling carelessness. Legal pulled the Choctaw Ridge file, the compliance filing, the Bartlesville freight renegotiation, and found the same architecture in everyone. His work in the substrate, her summary on top, his name in the correspondence, hers in the presentation. Then came the testimony. A junior analyst named Priya Ashworth, who had worked directly under Daniel for 8 months 2 years earlier, told HR she had once flagged an error in a client deliverable and been told by Renee to keep her name off the correction so it doesn't look like the department made a mistake. The fix went out under Renee's signature. Priya had never been thanked for finding it. A former account coordinator, Marcus Webb, who had left the firm the previous spring, told investigators at a transfer phone that he'd watching transpossibles get it rewritten under Renee's name with no changes beyond the letterhead. He said he hadn't filed a complaint at the time because he didn't think anyone would believe a coordinator over a director. And a woman named Carol Siemens, who had covered the front reception desk 6 years, told HR she remembered the morning, clearly remembered Daniel's face when he walked past her with the coffee box, and remembered thinking someone should say something and not saying it because it wasn't her place. She said she'd thought about that morning every day since. 3 people, 3 different kinds of silence, one method running underneath all of it. The resignation letter closed the question entirely, created at 8:44 a.m., populated with Daniel's employee number and title from a departmental template. He'd badged in at 9:41. The letter had existed for 57 minutes before the man it named ever walked through the door, which meant the lateness hadn't produced the decision. It had been an occasion looked for and found. General Counts put it plainly in the final report. There was no attendance pattern. There was no written warning. There was no representative offered. There was a top decile performer with 3 signed reviews and a document waiting for him before he ever sat down. HR then interviewed the 12 employees spoken in that hallway. Trent Wallace went first because he'd been in the room. He arrived with a prepared explanation about standards and got about 20 seconds into it before Eleanor asked him one question: had Daniel used the words $9.4 million out loud at that table? Trent looked at the table in front of him and said yes. Eleanor asked what he had written down instead. He said repeated availability concerns, because that was the phrase Renee had used, and he'd assumed she was holding information he wasn't. Eleanor asked if he'd verified any part of it. He said no. None of the 12 had checked anything. 4 admitted they'd joined the hallway conversation without knowing what the meeting had even been about. 2 said they'd assumed the department head must have grounds. 1 said she'd thought about asking a question, decided it wasn't her business, and without being asked, said but thought about that decision every single hour since. Renee came in at 3 with an attorney and tried one last time to hold a position. She said her intent had been to protect the department. She said she'd believed the Harmon terms were essentially complete and implementation was administrative. She said that if she'd known about Annex 4, she never would have proceeded. Eleanor told her that Daniel had raised the annex out loud in that conference room before ever signing anything, and that she had refused to hear it. She said the annex had been transmitted to Renee the previous Wednesday, and the receipt showed it had never been opened. The failure wasn't a missed clause, Eleanor said. The failure was 2 years of presenting another man's work as her own, followed by removing him the moment his visibility became a threat, with a document prepared before he ever arrived at the office. Then she asked whether Renee understood the exposure was no longer financial, because Grady had confirmed Harmon intended to approach Daniel directly. Renee had no answer for that either. At 10:50 that night, Eleanor drove back to Daniel's house a second time. She didn't bring a term sheet or general counsel. She brought a printed copy of the review, 61 pages, and set it on the kitchen table, and told him it was his, regardless of what he decided, because it was the record he'd said didn't exist. Daniel turned through it slowly. The correspondence log, the declined invitations, the transcript of the September review where his name never once appeared. The metadata line reading 844. Eleanor told him she wasn't going to ask him to come back because she'd asked twice and he'd answered clearly both times. She'd come to tell him what the company would do, whether he returned or not. Renee Sinclair would be terminated for abuse of authority and sustained misappropriation of subordinate work. The employees who had fabricated statements in that hallway would face documented consequences, because a floor that convicts a colleague in enforcement isn't a personnel problem, it's a culture. And the performance system that let a department head file 3 top decile reviews and then generate a resignation letter would be rebuilt so that client-facing work was attributed by record instead of by summary. Daniel asked why she was telling him if she wasn't asking. Eleanor said because he told her companies restructure while a contract is at risk and then go back to how they were. And she wanted the findings in his hands so that if it happened again, he'd be able to prove it. That was the thing that finally moved him. Not the money, not the title. He told her he had 3 conditions. First, the apology had to happen in front of the entire floor, not in a private letter, because the verdict had been passed in public and it wasn't going to be corrected in a closed room. Second, the new framework had to tie every client relationship permanently to the person who built it, and it had to apply to every department, not just his. Third, nobody was to be disciplined for having applauded it that morning, because half of them had clapped out of fear, not malice, and he had no interest in a company that punished fear. The ones who'd invented things they never checked were a different matter, and he left that decision to her. Eleanor accepted all 3. Daniel called Walter Grady himself 45 minutes before the termination notice was scheduled to Schmidt. He didn't make a case for the company. He told Grady exactly what had happened, including the parts that reflected badly on the firm. Then he said he intended to lead the program personally, and that Grady would be dealing with him, not a summary of him. Grady said that was the only thing his board had actually asked for. He withdrew the notice at 5. Retention hook. The following Monday, the floor Daniel walked back into was not the floor he'd walked out of 6 days earlier. Daniel returned the following Monday, 6 days after he'd left. Nobody was at the printer. Nobody was in the break room. 30 people stood in the open center of the floor because Eleanor had told them to be there at 9. His desk by the window had been left exactly as it was, on her written instruction cleared but untouched. The Harmon folder sat squared at the center where he'd left it, legal returning the original call copy that same week. Eleanor didn't use the conference room. She stood in the same open space where Renee had put her hand on the back of a chair 6 days earlier and told the floor that on the morning of October 15th, this company had pressured a top-performing employee into signing a resignation letter written before he ever arrived at work, and that not knowing about it wasn't her defense. It was her failure. She said the review had established that Daniel Foster built the Harmon relationship personally across 4 months, that the executed agreement named him 9 times, and the department had claimed his work in 3 consecutive executive reviews without ever once saying his name. Then she turned to him and apologized directly, in front of all of them, without a single qualifier. Daniel said very little. He told the floor he hadn't come back for the contract and hadn't come back for the title, and had turned both down twice already. He said he'd come back because the record now existed, and because it was going to protect the next person the way it had failed to protect him. The consequences moved through the department that week. Renee Sinclair was terminated for abuse of authority and misappropriation of subordinate work. Findings entered into her permanent employment record. She didn't appeal. Her attorney read the 61 pages and told her there was nothing in them to contest. Trent Wallace received a formal written sanction and was removed from client-facing accounts for a full year because he'd signed his name to a meeting record containing an allegation he'd never once tried to verify. 3 employees who'd admitted inventing statements in the hallway received documented warnings. Nobody was sanctioned for applauding. The pardon program launched 11 days later. Daniel ran the first working session from the same conference room where he'd signed a resignation letter, not sentiment, just the room with the better display. Walter Grady flew in for it, and on the first morning he shook Daniel's hand in front of the entire team and said, "And the point the strength of who'd argued against his own company employees that he wanted everyone in that room to understand exactly how close this had come to throwing that away." Daniel was appointed Director of Strategic Programs before the end of the month, with the Harmon Agreement reporting to him directly. He took the title this time. The reason he gave Eleanor wasn't ambition. He said the person who'd been able to erase him had held a title, and the only reliable protection against that was to hold one of his own. The new framework went live company-wide in January. Every client relationship now carried an origination record, naming the individual who built it, and that record couldn't be edited by department head. Executive reviews required the underlying correspondence instead of a summary. Any resignation document generated by a manager was flagged automatically to HR, with its creation timestamp attached a small technical change that existed entirely because of one metadata line reading 8444 in the morning. Renee left the building on a Thursday with a single box, and the floor she'd once celebrated on watched her go the same way it had watched Daniel go. She understood the symmetry perfectly, because she designed the original scene herself. She'd been for 5 weeks from a directorship she probably would have won. She'd held 3 signed reviews confirming that the strongest performer in the building reported to her, which is the single most valuable position a manager can occupy, and she'd experienced it as a threat instead of an asset. What she lost wasn't one promotion. It was every promotion after it, at every firm that would ever call Ashford & Cole for a reference. And the reason for it was written into a permanent record in language that couldn't be summarized away. The desk by the window sat empty for a while after Daniel moved upstairs. It went eventually to a junior analyst who'd asked about it on her first afternoon, and who, on being handed it, said nothing at all about the view. 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other, she found an error in a filing nobody else had caught, fixed it quietly, and put her own name on the correction because by then, the system let her. In any workplace, talent can be hidden by envy for a while. It cannot stay hidden forever. A good leader is not the one who removes the people who are better than they are. A good leader is the one who knows how to value them, and when ambition climbs above fairness, the price is never just one career. Sometimes it's the future of everyone still standing on that floor. If this story affected you, if it reminded you of a father, a mother, or a quiet coworker who never once asked for credit, stay a moment longer. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories about dignity, patience, and the quiet power of people who refuse to boast about what they've built. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. And in the comments tell us, has silence ever cost you the credit you deserved? Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.